Good morning. I'm David Dollar from the China Center here at Brookings, and I'm going to moderate this panel. And we've called it Domestic Challenges that China is facing as it aspires for these goals out to 2049. Now, of course, that's a huge topic, the domestic challenges. I'll just warn you right now, there are a number of important issues we're not going to cover on this panel. We'll get into financial sector reform in the next panel, and issues of state enterprise reform might come up there. But what we've chosen to do here is focus on 4 issues that generally fall in the category of social and environmental challenges. And as my colleague Chung Lee suggested, we have a lot of discussions in Washington about different topics concerning China. I don't think we really have covered that much some of these important domestic issues. So very happy that we're going to start with Professor Lei Xiaoyan, and she's going to talk about this critical issue of demographics. I wanted to start with that because I think that's really a defining issue for China. And then Wang Xun, who's a research fellow. All of the colleagues are from the National School of Development at Peking University. And Wang Xun is going to talk about the phenomenon of convergence and what are different convergence paths and what are some of the policies that will affect that. And then Wang Min is going to talk about consumption. And that may seem like a bit of an odd topic, but thinking about the different aspirations, part of which is about per capita income, in recent years, most of China's growth on the demand side has come from consumption. Investment has slowed down dramatically. There are fewer and fewer good investment opportunities. There's not much potential for net exports to contribute to China's growth in the near future for a variety of reasons. So China's been growing based on consumption. So as it develops and ages, it's natural to ask what's going to happen to consumption. And in all of these, we want to think about what are some of the policies that will direct outcomes in a better direction. And then last but not least, Professor Sujin Tao is going to talk about the environmental issues, including climate change. So I've asked each of them to stick to about 7 minutes to start, so we should have time to interact and open up to the audience. And we're going to start with Professor Lei Xiaoyan on demographics.
Okay, thank you. So for the demographics, in this chapter, we actually find 5 main trends of the population aging. So number 1 is population aging will deepen in the next 30 years. By 2049, the Chinese population over age 65 will be close to 400 million, which accounts for more than a quarter of the population. At the working age population will shrink. It started to shrink already, and it will further shrink from 990 million to about 800 million. 990 million to 800 million, which is about 200 million reduction in these 30 years. Number 2, not only the total population trend of the aging, but also the composition of the elderly will shrink, will shift from the young old to the oldest old. For young old, we mean 65 to 80. For oldest old, we mean age 80 and above. So by 2049, the proportion of Chinese oldest old in the aged population will be about 35%. Right now, it's about 20%. So that is a very big increase. Number 3, the composition of the working age population will also change. By 2049, the proportion of the older workforce will increase sharply from about 17% to 27%. For older workforce, we mean age 55 to 64. So the workers themselves will also become older. Number 4, the total dependence ratio will increase to about 72 by 2049. And among the total dependence ratio, the major part of that will be the elderly dependence ratio. So the elderly dependence ratio will reach about 50. And the burden of care for the elderly will be much larger than the burden for child care. Number 5, the family size will decrease from about 2.9 currently to about 2.5. That means we will have greater proportion of the elderly living alone. So the elderly people living alone will reach about 53 million. That will be about 10% of all the households. So that's the main trend. So we will have challenges according to that. There are 3 major challenges we will face. Number 1, that is a challenge for economic growth. So the reduction in the working age population and the increased deepening of the population aging will lead to increase in labor cost and contraction of profit margin. And also it may lower the rates of savings and investment. And of course, my colleague will address the importance of consumption later. Number 2 challenge is the financial pressure on the pension system. We will have the risk of a funding gap between it will become more dominant with the acceleration of population aging. Especially currently, we talk about the vacancy of the individual accounts and also the burden on the social pooling account. And with the sharp increasing of the number of pension recipients and the decreasing in the contributors, we will have more burden on pension system. Number 3 challenge is the rising burden of elderly care. So according to the research, there will be about 30% of the elderly people, the oldest old, will have some sort of difficulty in activity of daily living. That means they will need elderly care, very intensive elderly care. But with the composition change, we will have more oldest old, and also there will be more elderly people living alone with the migrating of their children and the shrinking of the number of children. That will become a big challenge in the future. So that's basically the 3 major challenges we face. Yeah.
So I think I'd actually like to follow up immediately with a policy question. So in your chapter, among all those statistics, the one that really grabbed me is this rising share of the older workers, the 55 to 64-year-old cohort. So the labor force is going to decline pretty dramatically, but the number of 55 to 64-year-olds is actually going to increase significantly. And as you say, their share is going to go up. So what are the policy implications of that? I mean, what can you do to keep that group productive and in the labor force?
Yeah, I think there are at least 2 policy suggestions for this part, shrinking of the working age population. Number 1 is the retirement system. I think we need to reform the retirement system. Currently, for men, Chinese men, we have a mandatory retirement age of 60. But for Chinese women, we have a retirement age of 50 for blue-collar workers and 55 for white-collar workers. That is actually very young, depending on the current life expectancy. So we need to consider extend the retirement age. That's the first one. And the second one, I think we should consider the education and the training program. So we are talking about the shrinking of demographic dividend, but now we may actually consider how to improve the demographic bonus to deeply explore that. So human capital may be one way we think about that. As you just mentioned, we have the larger fraction of the elderly workers, the education of those elderly workers is quite low. So we may have to improve the education of them, not the regular education level, but through the training program. So not only the regular education of the relatively young, but also the training program for the relatively older workers. Also, I think health is quite important. According to the China Health and the Retirement Study I am involved in, although we have longer life expectancy now, but the health status is not so good. So we have to invest more in health in order to improve the human capital, literally health capital, I think.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Lei. All of the topics on this panel are interrelated, so later we'll get to some of the air pollution issues and how that's affecting people's health, and so all of our issues are interrelated, so thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Wang Xun, talk about convergence. As Dean Yaoyang mentioned, one way to think about this aspiration of the Chinese is to reach about 45% of U.S. real per capita income by 2049. And that, in general, is what we think of as a convergence phenomenon. That I think China started out at about 4% of U.S. per capita GDP, and now, I believe the dean said it's up to 27, and the aspiration is 45. So let's talk about the Convergence Framework.
Okay. Morning, everyone. Glad to be here. I'd like to talk about two issues. One is the growth prospects, and the other thing is the determinants of a successful convergence. The first one is the growth prospects. Actually, our growth projections is based on the theory of convergence of per capita GDP in open economies. That is, according to the growth theory and empirical evidence, the lower the per capita GDP was at its initial period of opening up, the faster it grew in the following decades. Actually, I will not go detail about the techniques, and I will go directly to the main results. And on the basic assumption of successful convergence, we have found the following main results. The number one is that the potential GDP growth of China in the next 3 decades will decline gradually from around 7% in 2015 to around 3% in 2049. And number two is that the per capita GDP of China relative to that of the United States will rise gradually from 24% in 2015 to around 65% in 2049. According to the medicine database, the medicine database actually takes account into the PPP adjustment. Number three is that China's share in the world economy will approach 24% in the year of 2049. And number four is that China is expected to surpass U.S. In terms of GDP in the year around 2030. This is the main result of our growth projection. The second thing is the determinants of successful convergence. Actually, to find the following three results are important. Number one is that openness, actually, as suggested by Professor Prasad, openness, especially the trade openness, actually is the prerequisite for development countries to narrow the gap with leading economies, because openness actually provides opportunities for development countries to access technology spillover from the leading economy. That access actually is vital for the poor economy to take off. And also in the process of opening up, it is also important for development countries to enhance the protection of intellectual property rights, which will help create the sort of institutional environment conducive to innovation and technology transfer. Number two is that, as Professor Lei said, the aging population actually is increasingly becoming the drags on the sustainability of China's economic growth in the following 3 decades. And number three is that we find urbanization and the accumulation of human capitals are quite important for China to catch up in the three following decades. And we find that these two cannot be achieved separately, because in the process of urbanization, cities will become the centers of intellectual interchange and the recipients of technology inflow. And human capital actually is important for the ability of absorbing and of adopting and absorbing appropriate technology. But in most developing countries, the major fraction or a higher fraction of the population is in the rural area. Take China as an example. At the very beginning of China's opening up, actually 82% of the total population was concentrated in rural area. And at that time, the human capital of China was less than half that of the United States, and only 55% that of Japan. And even now, actually, we have much room to improve in these two areas. So to sum up, number one is that China's growth potential will slow down in the 3 following decades. Number two, further opening up actually is still important for China to catch up. And number three, China should promote the accumulation of human capital in the process of urbanization. I think I just stop here.
That was very clear and concise. Thank you very much. So these kind of historical, convergence estimates, obviously it relies on historical experience.
Yes.
So the world may change. We don't know if this will persist. But you emphasize in your chapter that you get this convergence among open economies.
Yes.
And my sense is when we look at this historical experience, that all of these economies have, not are they only relatively open at any given moment compared to their other developing countries, but they've all tended to continue to open up over time.
Exactly.
Right? So South Korea has become much more open in terms of trade and foreign investment over time.
Yes.
So my sense, and I should have prefaced this by saying that the chapter has different scenarios, and whether China's on a high path or a low path makes a pretty big difference by the time you get out to 2049.
Yes.
So one message I took away was China continuing to open up is important to try to get onto that higher growth path. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And talking about the policy implications, actually, I think China should further open up its domestic market to both the foreign capitals and the domestic private capital, and especially in the field of SOE sectors and the financial system. And actually, in the process of opening up, China should enhance the transparency of the domestic economic policies and the protection of both the intellectual property rights and the domestic private property rights, which will helps to reduce the policy uncertainty and enhance the incentive to innovate. And also, I think China should adopt measures to help the inner mobility, from the poor to rich, from rural to urban. Such measures should include, the elimination of hukou system and birth control policy, and improvement in the education system, especially for the migrant workers' children, and also improvement in the social security system. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to turn to Professor Wang Ming to talk about consumption. I think the convergence analysis in a lot of ways is really looking at the supply side. And as I mentioned in the intro, consumption is the main source of demand in China. That's likely to continue. So let's look at the picture of consumption out to 2049.
Okay. Thanks, David, for the introduction. So actually, I think this year, China will be the world's largest consumer market. So, and actually, in the past several years, consumption has already become the most important driving force for the economic growth. So just look at the number in 2018. So in 2018, the GDP growth rate about 6.6%. And actually, the consumption contributes about 77% of the total GDP growth rate. And the capital investment contribute about 32% of the GDP growth rate. And the net export negatively contribute about 9% of total GDP growth rate. So from the number, you can see actually the consumption has already become the most important factor, but in the future, it will continue to be the most important driver for the economic growth. So in my study, so to forecast the future consumption for 2049, we focus on actually 3 factors. Of course, there are many factors will affect consumptions, and we focus on income growth, aging, and urbanizations. Okay, as Professor Lei Xiaoye and Wang Xin mentioned, aging now become a very important concern for many people. Okay, we can see the media, a lot of news and reports said, okay, aging will be a bigger threat to China's future growth. But on the other hand, we can see that also in our study, we can show that the income growth and urbanization effect actually is way larger than the negative effect brought out by the aging on the total consumption. Now, the aging, the mechanism of the impact of the aging on the consumption is like this. So because the older earn less and consume less, so for the same size of the population, when there's more proportion of the older people, so the total consumption will be reduced. Okay, but from our calculation, the size on the 2049, the aging will only contribute about the negative 5% of the increase of the household consumption from now to 2049, only negative 5%. But the urbanization alone will contribute about 24% of the increase of the household consumption from today to 2049. So why urbanization will have such large impact on the consumption? There are 2 channels actually. One is that as low labor migrate to the cities, they will have a high income. So that's basically the income effect. That will increase their consumption. On the other hand, there are pure urbanization effect. So from the data, we look at the household survey data, macro data. For 2 family, one is living in the house rural, one is living the urban. If they have the exact same income, the rural household will consume more. Basically, urban household will consume more. For example, education. Basically, because in the city, in the urban, you have more, consumption choice. So there are 2 effects here. And okay, now let's look at the number of the urbanization rate in China. So in 2018, the official number for the urbanization in China is about 60%. So the 60%. But among the 60% of the population that working and living in the city, about 203 million population are actually rural migrants. They work in a year, most of them in a year in the cities, but their home, their family members are still working, living in the rural areas, which are maybe thousands or hundreds of miles away. And you think about that, if this size of population is like kind of 2/3 of total U.S. populations. 2/3 of U.S. population that work temporarily in cities, and their family member and the home are far away. So, and those population will not make investment in cities, especially like buying a house. So and if we take away all those rural migrants, the real urbanization rate is only about 43%. Okay, and another reason is for these rural migrants only temporarily work in the city, because China has a system called hukou system. Hukou system is kind of like a green card in the city, or like urban citizenship. Only if the rural migrants get the hukou, they can get access to the social welfare service in the cities, including public education, Medicare, and the Social Security. Now, for those 230 million rural migrants that work and live in the city, they cannot have this kind of social welfare service. And as I mentioned, now the real urbanization rate only 43%. But for a mature economy like the U.S. and other East Asia countries, the urbanization rate will be as high as 80% or 75%. So now China is way, slower than that number. So in the future, we are confident that we have a lot of work, a lot to do, a lot of space for the urbanization rate. So, okay, and lastly, I want to share the number we forecast for the 2049 China total consumption. Okay, let's first look at the 2018 number. In 2018, China's total consumption is about 38 trillion Chinese yuan. Among these 38 trillion, the household consumption is about 27 trillion. So our study is only focusing on the household consumption. Okay, now in 2018, the household consumption is about 27 trillion in China. If we assume that the GDP growth rate is on average about 4% from now to 2049, and the urbanization rate will reach as high as 80%, and given the projection of the aging structure, in 2049, the total household consumption could be around, based on our estimation, is around 98 trillion, from 27 to 98 trillion. And there is an increase about 70, so the increase size is about 70 trillion Chinese yuan of total consumption. And of course, the income growth will contribute most, like around maybe 80%. And as I mentioned, urbanization will contribute about 25% of the total increase of the consumption, and aging will contribute negatively, and about a negative 5% of the total consumption increase. Okay, that's basically what we find.
So I heard a really interesting symmetry between the last two presentations about this important issue of urbanization. So on the supply side, you need the agglomeration in order to get more productivity growth and higher GDP. And then on the demand side, you need more urban households to actually provide the demand. And so that's kind of win-win. So what, I mean, I've heard talk about reforming the hukou system for 20 years now. So why is it so difficult, and what's actually happening in terms of reforming hukou system?
The most difficult part is actually from the financial pressure from the local governments. So now the local government, actually, maybe you know that China's local government has a very large debt. And now So now there are many rural migrants working in the city, but the city government don't have to provide the social welfare to those rural migrants. But even given that, there's the debt, a lot of debt, but most of that was invested in the infrastructure. So the hukou system was founded in early 1960s. So now it's almost 60-year-old. And the main, but only because of the local government issue. But now, I want to share a very good news. Just last week, the central government made a big push on the hukou system. The central government just announced last week that all for the prefectural cities that with a metro population less than 3 million, for those cities, they just completely eradicated the hukou system. That means all rural migrants can get hukou in those cities. But for the prefectural city with the metro population above 3 million, basically very big, large cities, they can keep that. But for those, so look at the number, how large is the effect? China now has a total 293 prefectural cities. And for the cities with the metro population size above 3 million is only 27. That means about 270 cities will just, irradiate as hukou system. But I think it will take time, not an immediate effect, because, as I mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on the local government. They have to provide the public education service and the social security and the medical service. So it takes time. But it is a good signal and a message for the rural migrants. That means I can live permanently in the city without any discriminations. That will encourage their investment. Right? And then we'll encourage them to bring up their kids and the families and come to the city and live together. And then maybe then they will have more incentive to buy a house in the city. So all this will, boost the consumption for those rural migrants.
All right, thank you very much. And then last but not least, Professor Su-Jin Tao on the environmental issues.
Our sector focused on economic growth pattern change. And basically the general sentiment is that the economic growth pattern in China formed in the past 4 decades is no longer sustainable. We have to change it. In that, improving environment is the very important component. And we face great environmental challenges. There are a wide range of estimates, but people generally learn that environmental damages cause severe socio-economic costs, premature death, chronic diseases, and also China is a major carbon emitting country in the world. For the world to achieve the goal of carbon reduction, China has to do a lot more. So year 2020 is critical because all major emitting countries have to revise their NDCs. And there's particular high pressure on China to modify its NDC, basically improving the goals, the efforts in carbon reduction. So changing economic growth pattern is not only important for China, but also important for the whole world. And we have a lot of aspirations in this respect. First, for the future 30 years, by mid this century, our environmental quality will reach the WHO criteria and related to a lot of health improvement. And in order to do that, we have to do two things. We have to change our industrial structure. We used to be too heavy industry oriented. Heavy industry lead China's economic growth and also lead the export growth after WTO. But the carbon footprint has been too high. The second, we have to change our energy structure. So China environmental issue, carbon emission issue, all mainly related to China's energy structure. Used to rely on too much on fossil fuel. And in the future, we have to increase the share of renewables. And in order to achieve these two or three goals, we have institutional barriers to address. And we also have a price structure to improve. And we have to give local government, basically the policy implementing agencies, high incentive to implement environmental regulation and policies. And looking ahead, we see a lot of promises. And recently, our industry structure has been improving. But it might be mainly because of economic slowdown. So the concern from environmental sector is that if there's an economic recovery or if some stimulus is given, that structure might come back. We also see a lot of improvement in renewable energies. So our renewable energy grow fast, but the share is still low. But there's good development. Recently, we changed the compensation scheme from feed-in tariff to auctioning program. Wang Min has made major contribution to that development. And the price has gone down, again, dramatically. And there's new round of energy sector reform. Just like Wang Min said, last week we had the new government policy introducing higher involvement of market forces into energy sector, oil, gas sector. It's a very major breakthrough. And environmental tax was launched last year. But Chinese government also announced next year we will have a cap and trade scheme, nationwide cap and trade scheme. So a lot of market-based instruments have been introduced recently. But just still too slow to my mind. But the starting points are all there. So looking ahead, I'm cautiously optimistic. Okay.
So can I ask what the local government reaction is to things like the steeper environmental tax or the plan to have carbon trading? I mean, in general, we distinguish between administrative measures and market-based, and what I take from your chapter is urging for China to do more market-based. But what is the resistance to that?
We have to do more empirical analysis on that. But the belief is that the environmental tax will provide the local government a stronger incentive to do more in environmental protection, because the incentive will be more compatible with local government incentive structure. And the local government have too many responsibilities, too little budget, and to give them an incentive and for them to work harder on environmental protection, I think generating revenue from the action, I think is a reasonable policy thinking. And I see probably cap and trade is not in that line. I think we need to make cap and trade scheme also high incentive program for local government so that it will be more effective. So for now, I personally prefer environmental tax and the carbon tax. So it's debatable.
Can I ask who gets to keep the revenue from the environmental tax? Does
local
government?
It's a local tax.
Right. Okay. So that should increase the incentive for them to take it seriously, right?
Yeah.
So I've asked my questions as we've gone along, and we have a decent amount of time open up to the audience. We'll start with our distinguished friend Fred Berkston, who's got his hand up. We got microphones. We got microphones. Yeah.
David, thank you. And first of all, congratulations to you and your colleagues from Beijing. This is a terrific project. It'll make a huge contribution, and I think all of you should be very proud of it, and it's going to be extremely well received and extremely important. I have a couple of questions on the convergence presentation. You mentioned that your projection was that China's growth in 2049 would be dropping to about 3%.
Yes.
And David mentioned that you have different scenarios between now and then. I know how difficult these are, but I'd like to ask you for your best guess as to what the trajectory looks like between now and 2049 over these next 30 years. Is it going to be a gradual reduction from the 7% of 2015 to 3%? Or is it going to continue at the current 6 for a while and then drop? And give us a little more flavor of the path that you see for the Chinese economy over this period, and maybe what the key variables are in determining the difference between which scenario prevails. Openness is one that David mentioned, but give us a little more flavor of both the quantity and the qualitative nature of the evolution over this period. And then a very specific question, you mentioned that China's share of the world economy in 2049 would be about 24%. What's the U.S. share on your projections? By
Almost
that
the
time?
same.
The same.
Almost the same.
So rough equivalence.
Yes. Yes.
It's my own projection too, but that's confirming. So tell us about the trajectory.
So can I just amend it slightly, because we got 3 decades. So can we think of it, as 2030s, 2020s, 2030s, 2040? How do you see the growth rate?
Okay. Actually, in our upcoming book, of especially in my chapter, actually we did 3 scenarios. According to our projection framework, actually, the per capita GDP, the growth rate of per capita GDP of China actually depend on 3 arguments. One is the growth rate of per capita GDP of the leading economy. For example, the U.S. Actually, for the leading economy, the leading economy actually is on the steady state. Actually, we have 3 scenarios for the leading economy for the United States. Actually, one is 2%, the other one is 2.3%, and the third one is 2.6%. And the second argument actually, determining the process of convergence actually is the technology spillover. Actually, there is a parameter of technology spillover. And the third argument actually is the relative per capita of the developing follower and to the leading economy. So, according to our projection, in the following 3 decades, China's per capita, the growth rate of China's per capita actually will not suffer from a sharp decline. It will decline gradually. And if you look at the details in my chapter, we have divided the 3 decades into 5-year intervals, and you can find that the per capita GDP of China will decline gradually from at maybe 6.4% in the first 5-year interval. I mean between 2016 to 2020 to gradually to maybe 3.5% in the last five-year interval. And actually, just as I said at the beginning, the projection results actually are based on a basic assumption of successful convergence. Successful convergence means that actually there are two points about convergence. Convergence means the growth rate of per capita GDP converge to the leading economy, and the relative per capita GDP converge to one. I mean, the per capita GDP of China converge to per capita GDP of US. And actually, we do have some best scenarios. For example, China just shut down the door to the outside world. We can take the pre-reform period as a reference, and we find that in the pre-reform period, the average growth rate, I didn't remember the exact figure, maybe around 3.5 or so. In that case, the per capita GDP of China relative to that of the United States will grow gradually, actually from 24% maybe to 33, let me see, less than 40% in that case.
Just one quick follow-up, if I could. Presumably, the convergence continues beyond 2049.
Mm-hmm.
Do you do any projections out longer?
No, actually no. But you know that our projection, actually we use the historical data of similar open economies. And actually we want to use the data from World Bank. But World Bank actually, the data of the data from WDI actually trace back to 1960s. And if we want to make a much longer projection, we should have a much longer, data set. So we resort to, the Medicine 2018 and PWT 9.1, 9.0. Yeah.
Ken Lieberthal?
Hi again, congratulations on this study. I can't wait to get the book in hand and read it. It sounds like it will be tremendous. I have several questions for Professor Xu about your environmental considerations in this study. One, can you give us some more detail on the new environmental tax? How is that calculated? I mean, what is it actually taxing? And what are the mandates on how those revenues will be spent? Secondly, China is arguably the most vulnerable major country in the world to the impact of climate change, and China's own studies have shown that over the years. Are you figuring in sea level rise and its implications for the lower Yangtze and for the Pearl River Delta region? And this is also a question for China's projections of economic growth. The implications of sea level rise for the most productive parts of the Chinese, productive localities in the Chinese economy are truly dramatic. And the same is true with distribution of water availability in North China and South China and so forth. So with your concern with the environment, are you also factoring into your analysis the implications of what's going to happen to that environment over the coming 30 years for the array of issues that this book is considering? And finally, if I can abuse the privilege of asking more than two questions, with BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the concerns that climate scientists have is that a lot of the power generation facilities being built under BRI, in fact, are coal-fired power plants that will have an effective life of 40 years or so, and therefore will lock in, very likely, coal as a major source of CO2 emissions in developing countries for decades to come. And is that something that's being, as someone concerned with climate change in the Chinese environment, is that something that you see any way of reining in or making the BRI more of a clean power program? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. For the first one, basically we have some 40 years of experiences in pollution levy. Basically, we charge pollution emission for a fee. And so there had been formulas, the way of monitoring. So basically, the environmental tax is a legalization of that system. So pollution levy is a sectoral fee, but the tax became a fiscal revenue for local government. And so the tax rate is calculated based on what we call the pollution equivalent. They calculate pollution equivalent for your emission by different pollutants and calculate the tax liability, then charge the highest one to you. And the revenue goes to local taxation bureau as a local tax revenue, and also as a general fiscal revenue. It's not earmarked tax revenue. People would like to see that as a earmarked tax revenue for environmental protection, but it makes better economic sense to make it a general fiscal revenue for local government, because we want to give local government incentives. The second is that our national leaders has very strong support on climate action. So probably if you pay attention, the recent 5-6 years, China national government's attention on climate change has increased a lot because of our strong support from top leader of China. And there are a lot of considerations behind this. And I think that probably the first one is CO2 emission is highly correlated with domestic pollutions. And technology that's beneficial to reduce carbon emission probably is also beneficial to reduce criteria pollutions, because basically it all came from the same energy structure. So the need to improve domestic environment probably has played a very important role to China's improve the carbon climate position. And of course, there are a lot of sciences behind the change of climate strategy, including sea level rise. And from the World Bank report in 2012, China 2030, and so it's a joint project between World Bank and China's State Council Development Research Center. So it must have important impact on the decision makers. And sea level rise, so China was identified as the major country who suffers sea level rise from climate change. But there are a lot of analysis on impact of climate change on agriculture, and because our government emphasizes food security, and so the damage to agriculture will be a major concern. So there are a lot of sciences behind China's climate strategy. In terms of Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's still in the early pilot stage. It seems to be it's the major state company trying things in the Belt and Road countries, and I think we do see a lot of power plants built, like in Pakistan, a lot of countries, and more thermal-based power plants. But there are also renewable energies. Look at Pakistan's case. There are several renewable energy-based power plants also built. And I think China has comparative advantage in exploiting renewable energy technologies. I think it take a improved integrated approach from the decision-making process to ensure the Belt and Road Initiative is for the green growth. Yeah.
So why don't we take these two questions together, and then we're going to have to move on. Can you introduce yourselves?
Thank you. I'm Jean Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. So China and Vietnam are very close together as lips and tongue. All the difficulties you have in China has been transferred out to Vietnam. The situation of the Mekong River and the sea level rise and the salt water flooding into the rice paddies of Vietnam. I understand that the Lower Mekong River Commission has asked China for a long, long time, through decades, to stop the dams and talk to the people in the Lower Mekong River, especially Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. That has not happened. And for this year, there's significant drought affecting all the Lower Mekong River. I would like to ask China to take action and mitigate that from the Upper Mekong River, to stop the dams, and most of all, to work with the World Bank, the United Nations, the Lower Mekong River Commissions, to mitigate your action and mitigate the very damaging effects. There's another concern in Myanmar and the Upper Mekong River, because you diverted the water over to your own use. The water is unable to take the toxic waste down and out to the sea. So high level of toxic waste is being kept in the upper level of the Mekong River, Myanmar and other areas up there, including your country too. Arsenic and other toxic are now getting into food, into rice, and in many other food that is very dangerous to the people. We need to raise this, and I'm asking you all to take this into account. There's a question regarding the carbon emissions mitigation. China has moved many of its power plants run by coal to Vietnam. And it has been clear that for the last few years, Vietnam suffered pollutions even higher than Beijing, because China is moving its own coal plants power to Vietnam. And so the electricity to us are very high price. That is not acceptable. And if China is thinking that you're heading us in climate change and heading us in many other ways, we ask China to stop those coal plants in Vietnam and other countries, and at the most, spend some money and clean up what you have done. There are a lot of issues with toxic waste being pushed down to the South China Sea through Vietnam coast. And you heard that loud and clear 5 years back in Formosa, where tens of thousands of tons of fish were dying because of the steel industry from China being moved out and put on our seashores. Cambodia had refused to let it happen to them, but the Vietnamese people has suffered. We ask you to change that and stop stealing steel industry. And now Vietnam is suffering 450% of tariff on steels in Vietnam because of your action. So I know that you are scholars and economists, and if you care for the world, if China is stepping up as the world leaders in climate change and environmental issues, please don't do that while you're talking a different way. You need to take your actions. And I'm suggesting that you bring this back to Beijing. Thank you.
Let's take one more. I'm going to ask Professor Su to respond to that, but let's take one more, and then we're going to have to wrap this panel up. So.
Thanks very much. I'm Tom Orlick from Bloomberg. I have a question primarily on the convergence forecasts. So before I ask the question, let me just briefly echo the remarks of the previous people who said this seems like a really fascinating study, and I really look forward to getting my hands on the book when it comes out in May. Could I ask, what are the assumptions on the supply side of the economy which are embedded in the forecasts for convergence? When I think about the supply side of China's economy, I think about some of the demographic challenges we heard about from the first speaker, a shrinking working age population. I think about productivity growth, where the big gains from the shift from a rural to a manufacturing workforce have already been used up, and heightened trade tensions will make further productivity gains harder to achieve. And I think about a capital stock where there's already very, very significant overcapacity in a large number of sectors, and concerns that local governments and businesses have taken on too much debt. So across demographics, productivity, and the capital stock, I see some reasons for pessimism on China's capacity for convergence, and I'm wondering how that thinking is factored into your longer-term forecasts. Thank you.
Okay, so we do need brief responses to these, starting with Professor Su.
Okay, in terms of Mekong River issue, I'm not an expert or authority on that, but we had the same controversy inside China, because the dam building and also biodiversity conservation issue had been a major issue inside China, especially in the conservation world. I'm not directly involved, but I'm very sympathetic to that fight. Basically, we have that similar issue in China too. We're trying to protect the waterway, try to protect the biodiversity in the water environment. And I'm very sympathetic to that issue. I think Chinese government is open to debate, to discussion, and to international collaboration. But I'm not really authority to directly answer your question. The second is that from economic perspective, I think the shifting out of polluting industry seems to be a pollution haven issue. And 20 years ago, we had a very similar cry for that with the US, with all the developed countries, because seemingly you are cleaning up your environment, we are accepting all these polluting industries. And now it seems to be Vietnam is having that same issue. And I don't have a clever idea about that, but I think eventually we all have to have much stronger environmental policy, both in China and in Vietnam, Cambodia, in order to mitigate that issue. And maybe a universal carbon tax will help to mitigate the pollution haven phenomena, I think.
Okay, Wang Shun, you have to be very brief on
Okay.
what are some of the supply side assumptions?
Okay, actually, I think we can divide this question into 2 points. That is the short term and the long term. Actually, for doing a long term projection, actually we do not take into account short term fluctuations and other exogenous shocks. Actually, according to our projection, the most prominent risk in the short term actually is the downside risk, and also including financial risks. But actually, we do not take this kind of factors into account in our projection. And for me, the supply side issues actually are institutional issues, and I think there are at least 3. One is that we should further open up its domestic market, as I said, especially in the financial system and SOE sectors. And number 2 is that we should eliminate the distortions in the economy. For example, the productive factor, the price of productive factors. And third is that we should enhance the transparency of domestic economic policies, and also, the protection of not just the intellectual property right, but also, the domestic private property rights. Yeah.
Professor Lei wanted one last sentence.
Okay, I just want to add, for the economic growth, I may just emphasize the shortage of the working age population, the labor shortage. However, I just forgot to mention the positive side. Actually, in the other chapter of our book, we actually emphasize the technology change and AI that may solve part of the problem we face in the future about the labor shortage. And the other side is the consumption and the urbanization part. So actually, looking only at the demographic change, we may be very pessimistic. But if we look at the urbanization and the technology change, yeah, it looks more positive, actually.
So we've had an interesting discussion of some of the important domestic challenges. We've discussed a lot of policy issues like strengthening education and health aspects, pension reform, hukou reform, opening up the economy, environmental taxes and pricing. So let's give this group a big round of applause.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.